On November the 18th, 1978, so 40 years ago, although here in the Philippines, for example, it's already November the 19th, over 900 people were either murdered or either committed suicide or were murdered, especially if they were still infants, by drinking poisoned Kool-Aid juice in the so-called Jonestown compound of an apocalyptic cult led by Jim Jones. It was located in Guyana, South America. In the process of investigating this mysterious cult, U.S. Representative Leo J. Ryan was killed. It was officially called the People's Temple Agricultural Project. It was a remote settlement established by the People's Temple, an American cult, under the leadership of Reverend Jim Jones. And who was Jim Jones? He was born in May 1931 and committed suicide on November the 18th, 1978, at the age of 47. He achieved notoriety as the founder and leader of the People's Temple cult. He started the People's Temple in Indiana, Midwestern United States, during the 1950s. In 1956, he was officially ordained by the Independent Assemblies of God, in other words, a Pentecostal denomination. And in 1964, by the Disciples of Christ, an evangelical, somewhat Baptist-like denomination, now considered a mainstream or mainline Protestant denomination in the United States. He moved the temple to California in 1965 and gained notoriety with its activities in San Francisco in the early 1970s. He was married to Marceline Baldwin Jones from 1949 until their joint suicide in 1978. He had 9 children. He then relocated to Guyana. In 1978, media reports surfaced that human rights abuses were taking place in the People's Temple in Jonestown. U.S. Representative Ryan led a delegation into the commune to investigate what was happening. He and others were murdered by gunfire while boarding a return flight with defectors. He then committed a mass murder, or Jones then committed a mass murder-suicide of 918 of his followers, 304 of whom were children, almost all by cyanide poisoning via flavor aid. He was born in a rural area of Crete, Indiana, to James Thurman Jones, a World War I veteran, and Lynetta Putnam. He was of Irish and Welsh descent. Economic difficulties during the Great Depression led the Jones family to move to the town of Lynn in 1934, where Jones grew up in a shack without plumbing. He read a lot as a child, studying the late Soviet dictator Stalin, the original communist ideologist German Jewish Karl Marx, the late Chinese dictator Mao, the Indian independence movement's leader Mahatma Gandhi, and the late Nazi German dictator Adolf Hitler, carefully noting each leader's or influential figure's strengths and weaknesses. He also developed an intense interest in religion, especially because it was difficult for him to make friends. Childhood acquaintances later recalled Jones as being really weird, who was obsessed with religion and death. They alleged that he frequently held funerals for small animals on his parents' property and had stabbed a cat to death. Jones and a childhood friend both claimed that his father, who was an alcoholic, was associated with the Ku Klux Klan, which had gained a stronghold in Depression-era Indiana. After James and Lynetta Jones separated, Jones moved with his mother to Richmond, Indiana, where he graduated from high school in December 1948, aged 17, with honors. In 1949, he married nurse Marceline Baldwin. The couple moved to Bloomington, Indiana. He then attended Indiana University Bloomington, where a speech by former U.S. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt about the plight of African Americans impressed him. In 1951, he moved to Indianapolis, attending night school at Butler University, earning a degree in secondary education in 1961. In 1951, he had begun to attend gatherings of the Communist Party USA in Indianapolis. He had then become flustered with harassment during the McCarthy hearings in 1954. He was surprised when a Methodist district superintendent helped him to get a start in the church, even though he knew Jones to be a communist. In 1952, he became a student pastor at the Somerset Southside Methodist Church, but later claimed he left that church because its leaders barred him from integrating blacks into his congregation. Around this time, he witnessed a faith healing service at a Seventh-day Baptist church. He observed that it attracted people and their money, and concluded that with financial resources from such healings, he could help accomplish his social goals. He organized a mammoth religious convention to take place from June the 11th to 15th, 1956, in a cavernous Indianapolis hall called Cato Tabernacle. To draw the crowds, he needed a religious headliner, so he arranged to share the pulpit with the controversial, charismatic evangelist, Reverend William Branham, who was also known as a healing evangelist and religious author who at the time was as highly revered as Oral Roberts, although soon his popularity would start to decline, for example, because he left his original calling to administer healing to people and tried to become a Bible teacher, even though he was poor at reading and even though he didn't have the spiritual authority to work primarily as a Bible teacher. The People's Temple was initially launched as an interracial mission, which probably made it, at least initially, so popular, because in the 1950s, the so-called race relations, especially between the white Americans and African Americans or blacks, were controversial. And a great majority of the southern states in the United States continued to practice racial segregation until the early or mid-1960s, when the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act then officially ended the racial segregation, and then the U.S. Supreme Court ordered that busing, the transportation sometimes over many tens of kilometers of children and teenagers to achieve racially integrated schools. In 1960, Indianapolis Mayor Charles Boswell appointed Jones director of the Human Rights Commission. However, he ignored Boswell's advice to keep a low profile, finding new outlets for his views on local radio and television programs. He set up stings to catch restaurants refusing to serve black customers and wrote to American Nazi leaders and then passed their responses to the media. He received considerable criticism in Indiana for his integrationist views. A swastika was placed on the temple, a stick of dynamite was left in a temple coal pile, and a dead cat was thrown at Jones's house after a threatening phone call. Jim and Marceline Jones adopted several children of at least partly non-Caucasian or non-white ancestry. He referred to the household as his rainbow family. In 1961, he made a speech in the temple about a nuclear apocalypse. In January 1962, he sent an article to the Esquire magazine listing Belo Horizonte in Brazil as a safe place in a nuclear war. He traveled with his family to the city with the idea of establishing a new temple location. On his way to Brazil, Jones made his first trip into Guyana, which was still then a British colony. The Joneses rented a modest three-bedroom home in Belo Horizonte. He explored local Brazilian syncretic religions. Ultimately, the lack of resources in the locale led the Joneses to move to Rio de Janeiro in mid-1963, where they worked with the poor in Rio's slums. They then returned to California in December, or to Indiana in December 1963, and Jones claimed in his speech or sermon in his Indiana congregation that the world would be engulfed by a nuclear war on July the 15th, 1967. That would then create a new socialist Eden or paradise on earth, that the temple had to move to Northern California for safety. And they began to move to Redwood Valley, California, near the city of Ukiah. By the early 1970s, Jones began deriding traditional Christianity as a flyaway religion, rejecting the Bible as being a tool to oppress women and non-whites, and denouncing a sky god who was no god at all. He wrote a booklet entitled The Letter Killeth, criticizing the King James Bible. In 1976, John Maher had a phone conversation with Jones, and during that conversation, Jones alternately stated that he was an agnostic and an atheist. Despite the temple's fear that the Internal Revenue Service was investigating its religious tax exemption, Marceline Jones admitted in an interview to the New York Times in 1977 that Jones was trying to promote Marxism in the United States by mobilizing people through religion, citing the already then dead Chinese communist dictator Mao as his inspiration. Within 5 years of moving to California, the temple experienced a period of exponential growth and opened branches in cities including San Fernando, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. Unlike most cult leaders, Jones was able to gain public support and contact with prominent politicians at the local and federal level. For example, Jones and Moscone met privately the Democratic vice presidential candidate Senator Walter Mondale on his campaign airplane days before the 1976 U.S. presidential election, leading Mondale to publicly praise the temple. The new First Lady Rosalind Carter also personally met Jones on multiple occasions, corresponded with him about Cuba, and spoke with him at the grand opening of the San Francisco headquarters, where he received louder applause than Mrs. Carter. In his San Francisco apartment, Jones hosted local political figures, including Davis, for discussions. He had first started building Jonestown, formerly known as the People's Temple Agricultural Project, several years before the New West article was published. In the autumn of 1977, Tim Stone and other temple defectors with relatives in Jonestown formed a Concerned Relatives group. Stone traveled to Washington, D.C. in January 1978 to meet State Department officials and members of Congress, and wrote a white paper detailing his grievances against Jones and the temple. According to this Wikipedia article, Stone's efforts made California Congressman Leo Ryan furious. Ryan then wrote a letter on Stone's behalf to Guyanese Prime Minister Forbes Burnham. The Concerned Relatives also began a legal battle with the temple over the custody of Stone's son, John. Jones was facing increasing scrutiny in the summer of 1978 when he hired noted President John Kennedy assassination conspiracy theorists Mark Lane and Donald Freed to help make the case for a grand conspiracy by U.S. intelligence agencies against the temple. Jones told Lane he wanted to pull an Eldridge Cleaver, referring to fugitive Black Panther who was able to return to the U.S. after repairing his reputation. In November 1978, Congressman Leo Ryan led a fact-finding mission to Jonestown to investigate allegations of human rights abuses. His delegation included relatives of temple members and NBC camera crew and reporters for various newspapers. The group arrived in the Guyanese capital of Georgetown on November the 15th. On November the 17th, they traveled by airplane to Port Kaituma and then were transported to the Jonestown encampment in a limousine. Jones hosted a reception for the Ryan delegation that evening at the Central Pavilion in Jonestown. The delegation left hurriedly on the afternoon of November the 18th after Temple member Don Sly attacked Ryan with a knife. The attack was thwarted, bringing the visit to an abrupt end. Ryan and his delegation managed to take along 15 Temple members who had expressed a wish to leave. At that time, Jones made no attempt to prevent their departure. As members of the delegation boarded 2 airplanes at the airstrip of Port Kaituma, Jones's armed guards, called the Red Brigade, arrived on a tractor and trailer and began shooting at them. They managed to kill Congressman Ryan and 4 others near Guyana Airways Twin Otter aircraft. At the same time, one of the supposed defectors, Larry Layton, drew a weapon and began firing on members of the party that had already boarded a small Cessna. An NBC cameraman was able to capture footage of the first few seconds of the shooting at the Otter. And then later that same day, 918 inhabitants of Jonestown, 304 of them children, died of apparent cyanide poisoning, mostly in and around the settlement's main pavilion. This resulted in the greatest single loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act until the September the 11th, 2001 attacks. And some 14 and a half years later, in April 1993 in Waco, Texas, there were hundreds of people killed when another religious cult leader, David Koresh, apparently in retaliation at the FBI's special units who had invaded the compound, instigated that it was murder, suicide, or mass suicide by fire in that case. The FBI later recovered a 45-minute audio recording of the suicide in progress. On that tape, Jones told Temple members that the Soviet Union, with whom the Temple had been negotiating a potential exodus for months, would not take them after the airstrip murders. The reason given by Jones to commit suicide was consistent with his previously stated conspiracy theories of intelligence organizations allegedly conspiring against the Temple, that men would parachute in here on us, shoot some of our innocent babies, and that they would torture our children and some of our people here and our seniors. Parroting Jones's prior statements that hostile forces would convert captured children to fascism, one Temple member stated, "The ones that they take captured, they're gonna just let them grow up and be dummies." According to escaping Temple members, children were given the drink first and families were told to lie down together. Mass suicide had been previously discussed in simulated events called White Nights on a regular basis. During at least one such prior White Night, members had drunk liquid that Jones had falsely told them to be poison. Following the mass murder-suicide, Jones was found dead on the floor, resting on a pillow near his deck chair with a gunshot wound to his head. That Guyanese coroner Cyril Mutu stated was consistent with self-inflicted gunshot wound. His body was later dragged outside for examination and embalming. The official autopsy report conducted in December 1978 also confirmed his death as a suicide. An autopsy of Jones's body also showed levels of the barbiturate pentobarbital, which may have been lethal to humans who had not developed physiological tolerance. Although he was married to his wife Marceline from 1949 until their joint suicide in 1978, he had had numerous affairs, starting in 1968. The book The Road to Jonestown, written by Jeff Gwynne, stated or claimed that he occasionally had sex with male followers, and stated that he was most likely bisexual, although he was mainly attracted to women. While Jones banned sex among temple members outside marriage, he voraciously engaged in sexual relations with both male and female temple members. One of his sources of inspiration was the controversial International Peace Mission movement leader Father Divine. Stefan, Jim Jr., and Tim Jones did not take part in the mass suicide because they were playing with the People's Temple basketball team against the Guyanese national team in Georgetown, so they survived. At the time of the Jonestown mass suicide, Stefan and Tim were both 19 and Jim Jones Jr. was 18.